So this is the inverse trig worksheet video answer key. This is all review of some things that we've already learned over the past couple weeks, and it's just applying it. And I'm going to point out that I've already gone over this in the Zoom room, and I've talked about this where arc sine is the same thing as writing the sine inverse of something. We just write it as arc sine instead. So it still implies the inverse trig function, and the same thing with like arc tangent where I'm talking about my tangent inverse of something. But that's all that arc means, is the arc sine is the sine inverse. So all these questions are just asking us for the sine inverse or the tangent inverse of something. So for number one, the cosine inverse of root 3 over 2, we know that within the range that we have root 3 over 2, that this is the pi over 6 angle, because this is the angle which has a cosine value of root 3 over 2. Like over here, when I have the sine of -1 and we're talking about the arc sine of -1, I know that this is negative pi over 2 because this falls in the range of negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. It has that sine of -1. Here with the tangent of 1 within our range is pi over 4, and that is our angle. All these angles are unit circle angles, so this is really, really heavy review on this. Make sure that we know what we're doing and going over. Once we're here, this is where it kind of starts jumping into some other things. These first ones, when we're doing the cosine of the sine inverse or the sine of the cosine inverse, this is all based on unit circle angles, which we already have. So we're talking about the cosine of the sine inverse for root 3 over 2. That means we're talking about the cosine of the angle, which has an inverse sine of root 3 over 2. Within unit circle angles, this is a pi over 3 value, and the cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2, so that's our answer. I realize I'm working through this fairly quickly, but that's coming with a very strong knowledge of the unit circle and how this works. The sine of the cosine inverse of -1/2. I'm saying that I'm taking the sine of whatever angle has this cosine value. Within the domain rules of cosine, that means it has to be 2 pi over 3 because it has to fall between 0 and pi. So that means I'm talking about what is the sine of 2 pi over 3? Well, that's positive root 3 over 2, and that's my final answer. So it's pretty straightforward. Of once we have that angle, then we're just taking the sine, tangent, cosine of those angles, and all of these are within the unit circle. And they stay within the unit circle. It gets a little bit more complicated. The last few here, when we have 28 through 30, this is where we're actually breaking down again. The cosine of the sine of 8 over 17. Well, here I can draw out my triangle, and I know that I've got something in quadrant 1 with an opposite of 8 and a hypotenuse of 17. We'll do 17 squared is equal to 8 squared plus adjacent squared. 17 squared is, give me a second to pull up my calculator here, 289 is equal to 64 plus a squared. So we've got 225 is equal to a squared. So that means my adjacent side is equal to 15. So I'm looking at 15. And then my cosine of this theta is just equal to 15 over 17. So I stop there. So this is pretty heavy review of things that we've done. I just want you redoing this worksheet because it really emphasizes the unit circle angles and goes on from there. Now, 31 and 32 is also, these are fairly new things where we're looking at multiple sine inverse, cosine inverse, etc., etc. So if we look at, let's say 31, this is going to be the most complicated. We're doing the sine inverse of the cosine of the sine inverse of root 3 over 2. We're still working in order from inside out. So I'm saying that I want the inverse sine of the cosine of whatever angle has a sine of root 3 over 2. Well, the angle that has a sine of root 3 over 2 is pi over 3. The cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2, so now I'm doing the sine inverse of 1/2 because I'm taking the actual value of what the cosine of pi over 3 is, and the sine inverse of 1/2 is pi over 6. So this does shift around a little bit because I have that cosine in the middle, which shifts my numerical value. So it's still just working in order, and I'm working from inside out and just adding on to it. This worksheet should be pretty quick for you. It's just reviewing those basic principles, nothing too heavy here. If you have any questions, please reach out sooner rather than later.